Hello and welcome to Creative Writing Under the Apple Tree. I'm Roy Peachy, and today we're going to have an advanced lesson looking at a couple of things: narrative technique and also how we can respond to other pieces of writing. And I'm going to draw on the only passage from my novel, Between Darkness and Light, which started off as a creative writing exercise. I was teaching A-level English language and literature at the time, and there's a creative writing component to that. And I sent my students an exercise where they had to respond to a particular passage in a novel. And so I thought I'd give it a go myself. And that particular piece of work eventually, slightly transformed, worked its way into my novel, which I was writing at the time. And the passage I chose was from this book, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And there's this remarkable passage near the end where the first person narrator has been shot. There's a great opening sentence. I managed to get out of taking my French exams the next week due to the very excellent excuse of having a gunshot wound to the stomach. And then the passage which I particularly wanted to draw on describes the journey by ambulance to hospital. Now, in my novel, the narrator, actually not the narrator, the focalizer, the protagonist, is shot in the eye with an arrow in a childhood game of William Tell that goes wrong. And he's taken off to hospital not in an ambulance, but in a rickshaw. So there are some similarities, but a number of significant differences as well. Anyway, this is what Donna Tartt wrote. They said at the hospital that I was lucky. And I suppose I was. The bullets drilled me clean through, missing my intestinal wall by a millimetre or two, and my spleen by not much more, exiting about 1.5 inches to the right of where it came in. I lay flat on my back in the ambulance, feeling the summer night flash by warm and mysterious, kids on bikes, moths haunting the street lamps, and wondering if this was what it was like, if life sped up when you were about to die, bleeding richly, sensations fading round the edges. I kept thinking how funny this dark ride to the underworld, the tunnel illuminated by Shell Oil, Burger King. And then I'll just skip a little bit to the end of the paragraph. Neon lights, Motel 6, Dairy Queen, colours so bright they nearly broke my heart. And now I'll show you how I responded to that in my own novel. So here's my novel. The rickshaw passes along Chapoo Road. The driver is having to fight the crowd now, heaving his passengers through a sea that stubbornly refuses to be parted. Wang Weijun lifts his head and looks out of the window. Shanghai has been shattered. It fades in and out of focus. Shadows swirl and flicker, the dark rises. He shuts his right eye and tries again. The city coalesces. Now he can see that they are on Bubbling Well Road. Cricket Club Pavilion and the Country Club drift past, bold buildings from a world that has floated across the ocean to this bustling port and dumped itself on the seafront. It's just like Harold Godwin, his father says, interrupting his thoughts. He looks incredulous. Wang leans back. He does not know who Harold Godwin is. The name seems odd, foreign, threatening. Maybe he's one of the missionaries or Western bankers his father spends time with. Closing his eyes while his father chides his wife yet again for letting the boy out of the house, he burrows into himself, for he knows already that he has nothing that will dispel his agony or his loss. There is no longer any pain to speak of, only a tremendous ache and an irremediable confusion of vision. The sharpness of the neon lights refracting into shapes so jagged, so linear, that he senses they will never bend again. It feels as though he is falling off the edge of a world he never had time to examine. A sense of something gone forever. This is what hurts. Now the first change, and in some ways the most significant change, is from a first person to a third person narrative. However, although it's a third person narrator, what we have is everything from the perspective of Wang Weijun, the 8-year-old boy who's just had this horrific accident. So, for example, right near the start, we hear that Shanghai has been shattered. Well, of course, Shanghai hasn't been shattered, but it has been shattered for him. It fades in and out of focus for him. And so, as we read those sentences, we experience what Wang experiences. Shadows swirl and flicker, the dark rises. But then as he struggles with this lack of sight, when he closes his right eye and tries again, we begin to see with him. The city coalesces. Again, not literally, but for him it does coalesce. And so we now see Shanghai, and we experience what he was experiencing on that rickshaw ride. Bubbling Well Road, the Cricket Club Pavilion, and the Country Club, which are drifting past. Again, we get it very much from his perspective. That's what it seems like as he is going on the journey. It seems as if they are moving and he is staying still, because obviously he's had this traumatic injury, he's in some sort of shock. And yet we also have this further complication, because it is a third person narrator. It's not a first person narrative here. We haven't got Wang literally telling the story himself. So who is this third person narrator? Is it Wang looking back on the experience? Is it someone from outside the novel commenting on it? Whoever it is, they're very much thinking through Wang's mind, seeing through Wang's eyes. So for example, if we go into the last paragraph, we get this sense of the pain and the ache, the confusion of vision, but we also get the sharpness of the neon lights refracting into shapes so jagged and so linear that he senses they will never bend again. Now you can see where I've got those from. You can see the influence of Donna Tartt. Neon lights weren't around in Shanghai in 1900s. They came a little bit later. So is this Wang looking back? Is it him having, in a sense, a false memory or a partial memory, to be more accurate? What we have is a narrative which seems to encapsulate the past, 1900, when the accident happens, and the present, when the story is being remembered or retold. So by moving from a first-person narrator to a third-person narrator, we get some sort of opportunity to play around with the narrative and the perspectives, the point of view. What we also get, of course, is the alternative perspective of the father, who is incredulous. He can't believe this has happened to his son, but he's also drawing on his own Western education. His father has a one-eyed love of the West, and that metaphor runs through the book. But of course this is completely lost on the 8-year-old boy, so we get this mildly amusing section where Wang doesn't know who Harold Godwin is. He has no idea about the Battle of Hastings, so he assumes that Harold Godwin must be one of the missionaries or Western bankers his father spends time with. He completely misses the reference, and yet we, the readers, probably are getting the reference, and so we have some sort of privileged position that the 8-year-old child does not have. So again, there's levels of complexity within the narrative there that we're able to play around with just by changing the narrative point of view. What else have we got here? Well, we've got a real variety of sentence structures, and that probably again is influenced by some of Donna Tartt's sentences. So her final sentence that I read earlier, neon lights, Motel 6, Dairy Queen, very, very simple, grammatically incomplete. Bleeding richly is another of her sentences. And I picked up on that with sentences like, or his loss. Again, grammatically incomplete, as well as the variety between the very short, simple sentences, the city coalesces, and then the more complex ones. There is no longer any pain to speak of, only a tremendous ache and an irremediable confusion of vision, the sharpness of the neon lights refracting into shapes so jagged, so linear, that he senses they will never bend again. And of course, that's not the language of an 8-year-old. This is very much the language of an adult reflecting on the experience. And yet, we don't want to be distant from the experience. We want to be there with the boy. And so the advantage of this third-person narrator focalizing through the main character is that we get both. We get the experience and we also get the reflection on the experience. Maybe at the back of my mind, was Great Expectations as well. Wonderful book, narrated in a different way, where you get the perspective of Pip plus the perspective of the older Pip. If you look at that wonderful passage, maybe we'll have a look another day, that wonderful passage right at the start of the book where Pip first comes across Magwitch, and Magwitch turns him on his head, empties out his pockets, and yet the perspective we get is that of the young Pip. We get the boy's perspective, and then we're back again to the older Pip reflecting on what has happened to him. The narrative is beautifully constructed there. Okay, that's probably enough for now. What you might want to do is just pick a passage from a novel, perhaps a favourite novel, and then see if you can rewrite it for a different context, a different time. Donna Tartt is writing about America, late 20th century. I'm writing about Shanghai in 1900. Very different, and yet it's the journey to the hospital that holds the two together. And I'm inspired by the original but not tied to it. So there we are. I hope that was helpful, and I'll look forward to seeing you again on Creative Writing Under the Apple Tree. Thanks very much for joining me.